What were you thinking? Welcome to the next conversation hosted by Dr. Viepia Vol from the Institute for the Advancement of Cognitive Education, bringing you cutting-edge resources for better thinking and learning.
Good day, this is Dr. Viepia Vol. Today we've got a very exciting interview with Dr. Gwendolyn Kennard. She is from the United States. They are involved in a consultation business focusing specifically on mathematical thinking in the area of cognitive psychology. So Gwen, you are most welcome.
Thank you, William.
Won't you just tell us a bit more about yourself, what you are doing? It sounds very exciting, and how you got involved in mediated learning specifically.
Okay, so right now, my husband and I are in the process of continuing the development of our business, which is about 21 years old, and it's called RMT Laboratory, which RMT stands for Rigorous Mathematical Thinking. And this laboratory, this RMT laboratory is a laboratory of the mind. And what we do in this laboratory is we develop self-motivated, critical analytical thinkers. We develop deep understanding of mathematics, and we do that through the usage of what we call big ideas that we have identified from basic math and algebra, which develop that platform for advanced mathematics. We have capsulized the RMT laboratory as a laboratory of big ideas, and those ideas include investigating, discovering, experimenting, analyzing, and synthesizing. I'd like to just quote our belief about all learners. I think this goes right into the mediation.
Right.
So in every human being, although sometimes deeply embedded, lies a creative spirit, a quest for challenge, and a thirst for inquiry. The tunneling required to uncover these quiet and seemingly non-existent diamonds may be deep and intense, but the persistent, goal-oriented struggles truly provide breakthroughs to unexpendable enrichments.
That's beautifully said. I like it.
And I speak about in South Africa, you all know about diamonds, right?
Oh yeah,
so
of course.
You can appreciate what a diamond is and how valuable it is. So in each one of us lies those diamonds. And you know how your diamond might, you have to go deep to get those diamonds, don't you?
Yeah.
That's what we have to do as human beings, to uncover those diamonds within ourselves. And so we found that the best way to do that is through this laboratory approach, this laboratory of ideas. So mediated learning experience is a part of our mathematical learning activity that we develop as our, it's kind of a combination between, it infuses curriculum, instruction, and assessment.
Right.
And as we learn more about the mediated learning criteria, we understand that mediated learning transforms, and I can talk about that a little later, but it's transformational in its process.
So let's talk about the why of mediated learning,
Okay.
The rationale behind it, and this is an important question. As you know, we're busy with a whole series on Feuerstein's mediated learning experience, specifically the 12 parameters. So let's talk a bit about the rationale, the why behind MLE and instructional cognitive modifiability.
Humans are naturally equipped to learn through direct exposure to their environment. And so we think about observing an infant, how they look around, they're so curious, and they look at their fingers, and as they get older, they examine their toes, and this everything, a little piece of dust, everything is just amazing to them, mesmerized, and they come hardwired then with the ability to learn. But we're also a member of a group by reason of birth. We come through two parents, and with the virtue of the fact that we come through two parents makes us dependent upon those two parents to help us to make sense of what we have found ourselves a part of now in this physical plane, coming from birth, coming from inside the womb to outside. It's just fascinating.
Yeah.
So the need for mediated learning experience arises, and beginning then with the nurturing of the infant with physical food and love, the interaction between the mother and the child, the father and the child, the siblings and any other significant others, and what I call the village, then this mediated learning experience can manifest itself because our interactions are shaped and characterized by our culture. So this transmission of culture from generation to generation is primarily the work of the family. But now it's heavily influenced by institutions and customs that represent the society or the larger society in general. We all, as human beings, we have a need to perpetuate our culture. And so mediated learning experience is a powerful and dynamic tool then to perpetuate that culture. A structural way, a systemic way in which the culture can be transmitted. What we have found throughout our human experiences throughout the ages, that culture is not necessarily perfectly mediated. So what happens is we have some cultural deficiencies. There's some deficiencies in the culture. And so if there's deficiencies in the culture, there's going to be deficiencies in the human cognitively. And I must add, socio-emotionally. What mediated learning can do between the home and the transmission of culture in the home, the transmission of culture in the community, which is typically through the school, and the influence of the larger society, mediated learning experience can create a bridge. Because mediated learning experience can be seen and can be utilized as a tool and in the home, primarily starting with mom and then to the family as the children grow older. At school, where the schools transmit the culture of the society. Home transmits the culture of the self. Yes. Primarily development of the inner self, okay? And this is where Vygotsky comes in a lot, because he deals with language and culture.
Yes.
And the development of the self. And so this is where I say that education naturally occurs. Education kind of being defined as the drawing out of what is within. This could help to solve the problem. This, I think, is a part of the solution, is that if we understand and we value the role that parents play in education, schooling is going to be greatly facilitated because education doesn't just stop with parenting, but it continues on through the life of that person. So then that individual becomes a critical part of the perpetuation of culture and society.
Yes.
And so you see the dynamic of culture. Culture is dynamic. And I also quote Alex Kazulin. He says that generally education is the process by which a novice or a child or uninformed self acquires an individualized version of his or her group's culture. And so I have a question that emerges from Feuerstein's structural cognitive modifiability and the need for mediated learning experience. And that is, how does then Feuerstein's mediated learning experience, how does it create the bridge between home and school? And I would say the larger society for the learner. So this is where we begin to then look at intentionality reciprocity.
Right. Oh, that is so just well thought through. And what I like and what I hear is that it places education and learning right back in the context of relationships, starting with the home,
Thank you.
with the
Yes,
community, with society. And
right.
that's the beginning. That's the heartbeat of what mediated learning is. Education in the context of relationships, isn't it?
Right. That's perfectly put. Yes. Yes.
So let's move on. What is intentionality and reciprocity? I know there are 12 parameters. The
Right.
first three are universal parameters. They have to be
Yes.
present in all engagements,
Right.
not in perfect order, but they have to form the components of interaction. And of course, we're talking today about the first MLE parameter, intentionality and reciprocity. But what is it?
Right. Oh, I consider it the first criteria, and it's really the foremost criteria of Forstein's mediated learning experience. And so intentionality reciprocity, really, I call it a generator and a catapult. All mediated learning interactions must be intentional.
Very important.
So they have to be purposeful, in other words. They have to be purposeful. We have to know why we're doing what we're doing. And what that implies is that the mediator must come to the mediated learning experience prepared. You have to know who you are. So there's an identity component in intentionality. There is a character component in intentionality. Because as you said earlier, mediated learning experience is in education a relationship building mechanism.
Absolutely.
And so who you are is critical. It comes because it's going to be a part of your purpose. Within that purpose comes a necessity for direction. Where are you going? That direction then necessitates a vision. What is your vision? When you come as an educator, with that then, with that intention then, I must, and this is why my vision is so important, because my intention ultimately has to be to transcend that current situation that I and my students and also my colleagues find ourselves in. Whatever that is, if I'm teaching English, if I'm teaching second language, if I'm a special educator, my intention must be to transcend, because this is where the reciprocity comes in. So because my purpose, I want to transcend, but I want primarily the learner to transcend. That encompasses transformation. In other words, in transformation, I'm not going to be the same person cognitively, affectively, motivationally, or behaviorally than I was when I first came, which is challenging. So mediated learning experience takes courage. You have to be courageous. Also, the learning experience, the stimuli, the subject, whatever it is that the mediator is mediating and the learner is learning, that's also transformed through that interaction. What it does is it makes us rethink. We're forced to rethink what is the role of what I'm teaching in this person's life. So effective intentionality reciprocity, it catapults mediated learning experience into a deeper and more enriched interaction between the mediator and mediatee, and it also creates the path then for the development of other MLE criteria. So that's why I say it catapults. And if you know what a catapult is, it kind of flies you into it, okay? And I say catapult because it does. It's very dynamic. And then finally, through intentionality, the mediator or the teacher creates an atmosphere that then transforms the mediatee and the student's mistakes into opportunities for deeper learning. It's so important for the mediator or the teacher to really have a good handle of him or herself in relation to what he or she is teaching. And I'm saying that from experience, because you are immersing yourselves in their lives, in their culture. And what we experienced when we worked with, especially when we worked with the teachers, we taught teachers, my husband and I taught teachers. And what we experienced many times was the classroom becoming, what we call the classroom becoming one student. Everybody, it was a body. We just became a body. They just became so engaged, even the ones that didn't want to be a part. They found some way to be a part. And that's where that creation of that atmosphere.
Yeah. I never thought of it like that, but I think you're quite right. If one gets intentionality and reciprocity right, it's not only the stimuli, it's not only the mentor, it's not only the mentee that's transformed, it's the whole environment that gets transformed into a coherent learning experience. I mean, coherent whole. I never thought of it like that, but I think you hit the nail on the head. Well, Gwen, this is a very enriching conversation. Let's move on about the why. So why do you think is intentionality and reciprocity so important to enhance better thinking and learning in the classroom specifically?
Okay, let's talk about the classrooms, right? And remember, let's look at it from the standpoint of schooling, that transmission of society's culture and the human civilization in general to the learners. So that's our context. Okay, so then our reality is that in the home, mediation has not fully occurred, and I brought that up before. And so it produces deficiencies in the child's intellectual, emotional, attitudinal, motivational, and behavioral development. Therefore, children are not prepared to engage in formal schooling because they lack the tools and the competencies to fully participate. Now, Vygotsky has this idea of everyday concepts and scientific concepts. And I think that becomes important to kind of capsulize the difference between home and school. School primarily focuses on these distilled principles, ideas, and the theorems and the concepts that come from our understanding over the millennial, over the thousands of years that people have been in existence, and structures it in such a way that the child has to come with a skill set and a mindset to engage. And typically it's rigid, doesn't have to be. So this is our charge. We have to extract those strategies and those principles that are entrenched in that learning. We have to understand our discipline well enough to know what are the big ideas. You know, what is what we really need to teach the student. So then we create our lessons, right? And we orchestrate those lessons. And this is where mediated learning comes in and being intentional. So as the teacher and the students, or the mediator and mediatee, share the same intention, then the mediatee gains a better opportunity to fully participate in that learning experience. So as we mediate, we're going to mediate through asking questions. So we have to learn how to ask thoughtful and penetrating questions, questions that's going to make the student say, Then you're challenged, because while you're mediating the student, the mediator has to mediate him or herself. Yeah. So that's what part of that courage. Okay, so you got to mediate yourself to know what questions to ask. So this is where it's important for teachers to have the ability to be metacognitive. I have to think about my thinking and
Yes.
think about my doing. And sometimes you want to share your thinking out loud to the students so that you can model that. Tell the students, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tell you how I'm thinking about this. You brought up you asked me a powerful question, Joey. So I'm going to mediate. I'm going to show you how I'm thinking about what you just asked me. And so process it through. That also helps the mediator because you're becoming more vulnerable. And then it helps you to be able to self-mediate. But then it also helps the student to value that, hey, it's okay for me to think about my thinking. I think sometimes some students are afraid of thinking. They're afraid of their own thoughts. Then that creates a resistance. And so then the student becomes then more aware of this learning process. So as we internalize the awareness, we then are able to develop higher levels of modifiability, or that flexibility of thinking, and also of doing, and also of emotion and attitude, you know. And I know here in the United States, students that they tend to have attitude of resistance, and they'll be very creative in how they approach you. And they can be very offensive. And it really challenges the mediator. They've already told me they've checked out. But how do I get them to check back in? We have to always maintain a stance of openness, that even though I'm thoroughly offended by this student, I still want to reach him or her.
Gwen, how can intentionality and reciprocity be applied in the classroom? You listed wonderful practical ideas in your blog post, but would you just like to share with the listeners some of those practical suggestions, how it can be applied in the classroom?
Okay, so actually my applications, I found myself categorizing into 4 areas. So the first category is relationship building, which we've already established as being very important. The second is classroom climate improvement. The third is increasing student engagement and participation. And then the fourth is increasing student ownership for their own learning, which we call agency. And so in relationship building, this I found to be very effective, what we call KWL charts. What do you know? What do you already know? The W is then what do you want to know? And then we go through those 2 processes. And then after the learning process, it's what have you learned? And so this KWL is kind of like we call a pre-post. And so then in classroom climate improvement, which was my second category, you can plan for student roles and responsibilities and planning the classroom standards of behavior, and also classroom social activities. So what we want to do then is include the students in the planning. So then that kind of gets us into the idea of belonging. You belong here.
Yeah.
You're welcomed here. You have a voice here.
Yes.
We need your intelligence here. So number 3, the third category then would be then increasing student engagement and participation. And so what we would want to do then in that case is then create rotating student leaders. We want to create student leadership in academic and non-academic activities. So you have leadership, and then you want students to sit down and talk about their experiences and then raise questions. Okay, and then the fourth category then is increasing student ownership for their own learning. Now, this is a goal of mediated learning experience. We want students to own their own learning, to have agency, to be self-mediating, to have fully functioning cognitive functions or cognitive thinking skills. So one way we can prepare for this is by creating classroom and individual goals for learning and achievement. Goal setting is a part of intentionality. It's a part of having a purpose, part of the structural aspect, okay? So we're creating structure when we create goals. You're also then being able to differentiate learning by individuals developing goals. Then they're going to start taking more ownership for their own learning. They're beginning to see the discipline in relation to their own personal growth. And then the final comment that I want to convey is to increase students' vocabulary and language usage. And that's home and school language. Okay, and there's various ways we can do this. And that's where the home language is so important. The more that the student understands his or her own home language, because some students don't understand their language formally. They just know the verbal language, but they don't understand the formality of the language, the grammatical structures. So our home language is important for us to bring to the table as we're learning another language.
Gwen, thank you very much. This was a very insightful conversation, I think very helpful, especially to the challenges that we experience in South Africa, but also, I believe, to other developing countries and marginal groups around the world. So thank you for your open sharing of your expertise and your knowledge. And we want to wish you all the best with the wonderful work that you're doing at the RMT laboratory. I think you're doing great work.
Thank you.
One day when you've got an opportunity, we would be happy to welcome you back in South Africa.
Yes, and I would love to be back too. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. That was Dr. Gwendolyn Kennard from the RMT laboratory in the Chicago, Illinois area in the United States.
This podcast was brought to you by the Institute for the Advancement of Cognitive Education. Visit our website at www.ilearnthinking.org or on social media at iLearnThinking.